In 1871 and 1872, Fall River, Massachusetts opened 22 new cotton mills and absorbed roughly 20,000 new residents in 24 months. Nothing like it before or since. By 1876, the same city held one-sixth of all the cotton spinning capacity in New England and printed half of all the cotton cloth manufactured anywhere in the United States. Today, the granite walls raised during that boom hold discount clothing racks and secondhand furniture showrooms, and the river that once turned every wheel inside them runs beneath a highway on-ramp, out of sight and mostly out of memory. This is the story of the fastest-built industrial city in 19th century America, and of how completely a place can lose the one thing that ever justified its existence. Chapter 1. The River Made of Steps. Fall River did not begin with a corporation or a charter. It began with a slope. North of Mount Hope Bay, a chain of ponds drained toward the sea through a channel barely half a mile long, dropping roughly 130 feet through 8 distinct falls cut into a bed of solid granite before the fresh water finally met the salt. The Wampanoag people who had lived along its banks for generations before any mill existed called it Kekishan, commonly translated as falling water, a name that described exactly what the place was and, in time, exactly what it would be worth. The granite under that water was not an obstacle to industry. It was the industry's first piece of free capital, laid down long before anyone in New England owned a spindle. A ledge of solid stone meant a foundation that required no pilings, no reinforcement, no decade of settling before a wall could bear weight. Millwrights did not build beside the Kekishan and cut a channel to reach it. They built directly over the stream itself, setting their wheels into the riverbed, the way a smith sets a blade into a handle, so that the falling water and the working floor above it were, in the most literal sense, one structure. The river did not power the mills from a distance. It ran underneath them. The town incorporated in 1803 a modest administrative fact that drew little notice beyond the county line. It would not stay modest. 8 years later, in 1811, the first cotton mill rose beside the falls, a small operation powered by a single wheel turning in a river that had been waiting geologically for several thousand years to be useful in precisely this way. 30 miles north, at almost the same historical moment, Boston merchants were laying out an entirely different kind of town. Lowell was planned before it was built, streets surveyed, canals engineered, capital raised in State Street counting houses, and dispatched to the Merrimack in organized installments. A corporation town assembled by men who had never lived within 100 miles of it. Fall River grew the opposite way. No single company platted its streets or floated its bonds. A mill went up because a local family held the water rights and the timber and enough standing at the county bank to get a wheel turning, and then another family did the same thing a quarter-mile downstream, and then another after that. It was not a plantation engineered from a ledger in a Boston office. It was a boomtown, built mill by mill on money that had been made, borrowed, and risked within walking distance of the falls. The falls were not the only gift the coastline made. Mount Hope Bay reached deep enough inland to bring full ocean-going vessels straight to Fall River's wharves, and what those vessels carried mattered nearly as much as what the river turned. Southern cotton came up from Charleston and New Orleans and landed close enough to the mills that it barely needed a wagon. Coal came the same way, and coal would matter more with every passing decade because a river with 8 falls and a fixed drop has only so much power in it, and sooner or later the Kekishan alone would not be enough. Between the falling fresh water at one end of the town and the salt water at the other, the geography had supplied everything a textile city required before a single loom was ordered: power to turn the wheels, stone to raise the walls, a harbor to carry the cotton in, and the cloth back out. None of this required a visionary. It required a family willing to buy in early and in 1821, one of them did. A local farmer's son, with no particular claim to fame beyond a name well known around the parish, put his money into a share of a small grist mill on the Kekishan. It looked at the time like nothing at all. Chapter 2. The Borden Machine. The farmer's son was Richard Borden. Colonel Richard Borden in time, a militia rank he wore for the rest of his life, long after he had stopped needing to prove himself to anyone. And the grist mill share was not an investment so much as an apprenticeship. He learned in those first years what every miller on the Quekichan already knew from the inside of a wheel pit: how much fall a given stretch of river delivered. A dry August thinned the current to a trickle. A spring freshet could tear gearing loose from its mounts. It was not the education of a man born to run an empire. It was the education of a man who understood water. And in Fall River, water was the only credential that mattered. In 1821, Borden took what he had learned and partnered it with a man who knew iron the way he knew water. Major Bradford Durfee had spent his working life around vessels and machinery rather than looms, a builder of things meant to hold together under strain. Together, the two men founded the Fall River Iron Works, a plant with no interest in spinning a single thread of cotton. Its business was to make what the mills could not make for themselves: shafting to carry power from the wheel to the floor above it, nails by the barrel, castings and gearing size to whatever a mill agent asked for that month. Decades later, as the rail lines reached the city, the same works would turn out locomotives. This was the part of Fall River's rise that never showed up on any single mill's account book. Every new cotton corporation that went up along the falls needed iron before it needed a bale of cotton, and the iron works supplied it at a markup to nearly all of them. A mill and its supplier are usually two separate fortunes, competing for the same dollar. In Fall River, they became one fortune, wearing two names. They became, before long, one family. The Bordens and the Durfees intermarried across the following decades until the business partnership was a bloodline, and the bloodline reached outward into every institution the growing city required. A Borden or a Durfee sat on the board of the bank that financed the next mill. A Borden or a Durfee held stock in the railroad that carried the coal in and the cloth out. A Borden or a Durfee owned a piece of the gas works that lit the floors after dark. None of it required a conspiracy. It required a family that had gotten to the water first and had the sense to keep marrying itself back together every time a new industry opened around it. The system reached the harbor in 1847. Richard Borden and his brother Jefferson had already built the iron, financed the banks, and wired the city with gas. What they built that year was the exit. The Bay State Steamboat Company put a line of overnight steamers between Fall River's wharves and Manhattan, timed to a rail connection that carried passengers on to Boston by morning. A traveler could board at dusk, sleep in a stateroom on Long Island Sound, and wake in New York. Cotton and finished cloth went out the same route, riding the cargo holds beneath the staterooms. The Fall River line would run for 90 years, carrying presidents and millionaires to bed on water that within living memory had only ever turned a grist wheel. By 1868, the mills the iron works had supplied and the line had given an outlet to were turning out more spinning capacity than Lowell carried on the Merrimack. The town Boston had built as the model every mill city was supposed to follow. Fall River passed it without a dollar of Boston money behind it. What that much spindle capacity was about to draw into the city in the 4 years that followed was nothing any Borden or Durfee had built on purpose. Chapter 3. Spindle City. By 1868, the numbers had already answered the only question that mattered. Along the Merrimack and the Kekishan, both. Which city spun more cotton? Fall River's mills, fed by the iron works, and financed by the same intermarried families that ran its banks, had passed Lowell's 5 decades of planned growth, with something over 500,000 spindles turning inside its granite walls. Lowell had been built first, financed first, celebrated first, as the American answer to Manchester. Fall River had simply outspun it, on local money, in less time. What came next was not growth in the ordinary sense, it was closer to detonation. In the 2 years spanning 1871 and 1872, 15 new textile corporations organized in Fall River, and 22 new mills rose along the falls and the harbor to house them. The city absorbed something close to 20,000 new residents inside those same 24 months, arriving faster than the tenements could be framed to hold them. Spinning capacity crossed 1 million spindles before the second year was finished. Double what had stood in 1868, doubled again in a span shorter than most single mills had taken to build. No American city before it had added an industrial base of that size that quickly. The newspapers of the period reached for the only comparison that fit: Manchester, England, the largest textile city on earth, and even that comparison put Fall River in second place, rather than 5th or 10th. The mills built to house that capacity were not utilitarian sheds. They were granite fortresses, 5 and 6 stories of native stone quarried within a few miles of where it was laid, some running 1/5 of a mile from end to end along a single street. Towers rose at their corners, less for ornament than for the stare, and hoist shafts a building of that length required. And bells hung in them to call 600 hands to a floor at the same minute every morning. The names went up over the doors in stone and iron: Granite, Pocasset, American, Durfee, Border City, a roll call of the families in the ground that had financed them, repeated on payroll ledgers for the next 60 years. Around those walls, the city arranged itself the way smoke arranges itself around a chimney. On the highlands above the mill floor and above the coal smoke that hung over it most mornings, the agents who ran the corporations built themselves mansions with a view down onto the very buildings that paid for them. Below, packed along the flats between the mills and the harbor, 3-decker tenements rose in tight rows, 3 families stacked one above the next, close enough to the bell towers that a worker could hear the first ring without leaving the kitchen. The hands who filled those tenements did not arrive all at once, and they did not arrive from one place. Lancashire spinners came first, bringing a trade they had learned in Manchester's own mills, with Irish laborers close behind them, filling the unskilled floors the spinners did not want. Then, by the trainload down from Quebec and New Brunswick came the French Canadians, drawn south by wages no farm in the St. Lawrence Valley could match. The Portuguese arrived later still, crossing by packet ship out of the Azores, and in the end outnumbered every group that had come before them. By the turn of the century, Fall River counted among the most foreign-born cities in the United States, and inside a single mill floor, a foreman might give the same order in 6 different languages before every hand understood it. On the morning of September 19th, 1874, the day shift at the granite mill began the way every shift in the city began. The bell, the belts, the looms, picking up their rhythm one floor at a time. Nothing in the schedule that morning distinguished it from the several thousand mornings that had come before it. By the time the bell rang again, that would no longer be true. Chapter 4. The Granite Mill. The fire started on an upper floor, in or near the picker room, where cotton waste and machine oil sat closest to open gas jets and shafting running at full speed. Almost 600 hands were on the floors above and below it that morning, spinners and weavers and doffers working a mill, built the way every mill on the Quequechan was built, tall, narrow, and designed around production rather than escape. The granite mill belonged to the same web of Fall River capital that ran the ironworks and the banks that financed it. 5 or 6 stories of the same native stone raised along every other stretch of the falls. A single staircase, several feet wide, connected those floors to one exit at ground level. That staircase had never needed to move 600 people at once. On the morning of September 19, 1874, it did. Cotton lint burns the way flour burns, fast and total, and the granite mill's floors were coated in it after years of spinning. The fire found the lint within minutes, climbed the shafting and the belting toward the ceiling, and reached the stairwell. Smoke filled the one staircase the building had before flame did, and the men and women working the upper floors discovered, inside a few minutes, that the way down no longer existed. The windows were the only opening left. Some of the workers were young women who had been at their frames since 6 that morning, spinning cotton unloaded off ships that had docked at the same wharves the Bordens had built. They jumped. Neighbors and mill hands from adjoining buildings heard the alarm bells across the flats and ran ladders against the walls. But the ladders available in Fall River in 1874 reached 2 stories up, not the floors where the trapped hands stood, and there was no fire escape law yet requiring anything more. Some jumpers caught awnings or ropes lowered from the floor above. Most did not. The ground beneath the windows was granite paving, not grass, and the drop from an upper floor of the granite mill was not a fall a body walked away from. By the time the fire was out, roughly 30 workers were dead, and a larger number were maimed for the rest of their lives. Broken backs, crushed legs, burns that never fully healed. It was the deadliest mill fire in the city's history, before or since. The inquest that followed found the stairwell, not the fire, responsible for most of the deaths. One exit had never been adequate capacity for a floor of that size, and nothing before September 19th had required anyone to prove otherwise. The finding changed remarkably little. The granite mill was rebuilt on the same foundation within the year, with the same layout, financed in part by an insurance settlement paid without serious dispute. The spindles went back in. The bell rang again on schedule, calling hands to floors that were, structurally, almost identical to the ones 30 people had just died trying to leave. Fall River kept building through it, the way it kept building through everything. New mills, more capacity, more corporations organized along the same falls, as if the fire had been a cost of production rather than a warning worth acting on. 18 years later, a different address in the same city would draw more attention than every mill the Bordens and Durfees had ever built combined. It was not a mill, and it was not on the river. It was a house on 2nd Street. Chapter 5. The House on 2nd Street. It was a house on 2nd Street, and it belonged to Andrew Jackson Borden. He carried the name that hung over half the ledgers in Fall River. Bank directorships, mill directorships, blocks of downtown real estate bought cheap and held for decades. Yet he had built nothing on the scale of the ironworks. And he had never moved his family up onto the highlands, where the mansions stood above the smoke. Andrew Borden was, by the accounting that mattered in the city, a wealthy man. He lived like one who intended to stay that way. The house on 2nd Street had no bathroom, no running hot water, only a single cold tap and an outhouse behind the barn, in a decade when men with a fraction of his holdings had already piped gas and heated water through their homes. Frugality of that particular kind was its own form of status inside the family, a way of saying that money once made was not for spending on comfort. Lizzie and her older sister Emma, both grown women in their 30s, still lived under their father's roof on 2nd Street rather than in any household of their own, an arrangement common enough among unmarried daughters of the period but conspicuous in a family whose name sat on bank charters and mill boards across the city. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, Andrew Borden's second wife, Abby, was found dead in an upstairs guest room, struck repeatedly about the head with a bladed instrument the newspapers would settle on calling a hatchet. Andrew was found roughly 90 minutes later on a sitting room sofa downstairs, killed the same way. Bridget Sullivan, the family's maid, had been in the house through the morning and had heard nothing that alarmed her before the second body was discovered. Lizzie Borden, Andrew's 32-year-old daughter from his first marriage, raised the alarm, and within days she was the only person Fall River's police considered seriously. The case went to trial in June 1893, not in Fall River but 30 miles south, in New Bedford, before the Massachusetts Superior Court. Reporters arrived from New York, from Boston, from Chicago, from papers that had never before sent a correspondent to cover a Massachusetts criminal case. New Bedford's hotels filled past capacity for the length of the proceedings, and telegraph offices added staff to keep pace with the daily columns of testimony wired out to the rest of the country. The prosecution had a hatchet with no confirmed blood, a set of inconsistent statements, and an account of Lizzie attempting, the day before the murders, to buy prussic acid from a local pharmacist and being refused. It did not have a witness, a confession, or a weapon anyone could place in her hand. The jury acquitted her after a single hour of deliberation. No one else was ever charged. Fall River had, by then, buried a great many of its dead quietly. Mill accidents, tenement fevers, 30 bodies pulled from a single stairwell in 1874. None of that had traveled. The Borden case traveled everywhere. Within months, a rhyme was circulating in penny papers and schoolyards from Massachusetts to California, 4 lines that miscounted the wounds on both victims and never once mentioned a trial, an acquittal, or a reasonable doubt. It has outlived the Iron Works. It has outlived the Fall River line. It has outlived every mill the Bordens and the Durfees ever financed. A city built by a dynasty of bankers and mill agents became known, to most of the country, for a single address and an axe. The mills, meanwhile, were closing in on a summit of their own. More spindles, more workers, more capital than the city had ever held at one time. That summit was already hollow. Chapter 6. A Hollow Summit. By 1910, the summit Fall River had been climbing since the Borden generation was visible from every mill floor in the city, and by 1920, the city was standing on top of it. More than 100 mills operated inside the city limits that decade, spinning, weaving, and printing under names that had multiplied faster than any single family could track: Granite, Pocasset, American, Durfee, Border City, and dozens organized in the decades since. Roughly 30,000 men, women, and children worked those floors at the peak, more hands inside mill walls than most American cities counted across their entire population. The 1920 census recorded Fall River's own population approaching 120,000, the largest count the city would ever record, before or since. On the waterfront, the American Printing Company's works had grown into the largest cotton cloth printing operation on earth, a single complex stamping and dyeing more yardage in a week than most nations' textile industries finished in a month. Picture South Main Street on a Saturday evening in 1911. Electric trolleys clatter past shop windows crowded with goods from Boston and New York. Dry goods, gramophones, factory shoes, priced against wages the mills had paid out that same afternoon. The sidewalk carries 6 languages at once: English, French, Portuguese, Polish, Italian. The Lancashire vowels the first spinners brought over, bells from the Pocasset, the Durfee, and 100 other towers mark the hour in overlapping peals that no one downtown still hears as sound. At the wharf, the Fall River Line's night boat casts off for Manhattan, lit stem to stern, carrying passengers who will breakfast in New York on cloth the city wove that morning. A settlement that had been 8 waterfalls and a scatter of ponds in 1803 now ran on its own electricity, brighter after dark than the water that built it had ever needed to be. The numbers that made 1911 look invincible were counting the wrong thing. Fall River's mills spun mostly a single grade of cloth, plain, unbleached print cloth, the cheapest and most standardized cotton good manufactured in America, The same weight and weave repeated floor after floor because it was the one product 100 competing corporations could all make without retooling. Print cloth asked nothing special of a mill. It asked cheap cotton, a working loom, and hands willing to run it, and none of those three things required Fall River specifically. Mills rising in Georgia and the Carolinas were built with new machinery, bought outright rather than inherited from the 1870s, staffed by labor paid a fraction of a New England wage, standing close enough to the cotton fields that freight barely entered the ledger, and free of the unions that Fall River's workforce, after decades of strikes over speed-up and wage cuts, had built into the city's institutions. A mill in Fall River and a mill in Gastonia could turn out the identical bolt of cloth. The only difference between them was cost. For a few years, the war disguised the problem. Between 1917 and 1918, the federal government needed uniform cloth and tent canvas in quantities no single region could refuse, and Fall River's looms ran at capacity on government contracts that asked nothing about who could make the same cloth cheaper once the shooting stopped. The contracts ended with the armistice. Peacetime demand never returned to wartime levels, and 100 mills built to run at wartime capacity were left competing for a shrinking order book against a South that had spent those same war years installing newer machinery, paid for by the very contracts Fall River had filled. The price of a yard of print cloth fell through 1920, fell again through 1921, and kept falling. In 1923, the first Fall River mills closed their gates for good. The city could tell itself, in 1923, that this was the work of outsiders, competitors in Georgia and the Carolinas, undercutting a business Fall River had invented. That comfort lasted less than a year. In 1924, the decision that mattered was not made in Gastonia or in Augusta. It was made a few blocks from South Main Street, inside the mill the city had always pointed to as proof it could not lose. Chapter 7. The Flagship Leaves. In 1924, the American Printing Company, the same waterfront complex that had spent a decade calling itself the largest cotton cloth printer on earth, opened a new plant in Kingsport, Tennessee, and began moving work south. The company did not describe it as abandonment. It described it as expansion, a second site rather than a first replacement, the ordinary language any departing employer reaches for on its way out the door. But American Printing was not one competitor among 100. It was Fall River's largest single employer, the firm the city had pointed to for years as proof that Georgia and the Carolinas could undercut everyone else and still never touch the flagship. The flagship touched itself. Jobs at the waterfront works fell through the years that followed, cut not by a rival mill in Gastonia, but by the company's own ledger, weighing a Tennessee payroll against a Massachusetts one and choosing Tennessee. If the mill the city trusted most could not resist that arithmetic, no mill in Fall River was going to. The rest of the decade did not wait for an announcement as clean as Kingsport's. Mills along the falls and down through the flats closed through the late 1920s one after another, most of them without a stated reason beyond a notice on the gate and a payroll that stopped. Spindles went to auction by the thousand, sold for scrap iron or crated south to mills that wanted the machinery without wanting to compete against Fall River for labor first. Granite floors built to carry 1,000 looms at once, shaking with the same rhythm since 1872, went silent. A mill at a time, then several at a time. Between 1923 and 1932, most of the spinning and weaving capacity that had once made Fall River second only to Manchester simply ceased to exist. No single event caused it. It was the same decision, made by a different mill treasurer, repeated for the better part of a decade. On February 2, 1928, a crew demolishing the closed Pocasset mill let a fire get loose in the wreckage. Fed by years of oil-soaked timber and cotton lint in a building nobody was paying to watch anymore, the fire jumped clear of the demolition site and ran into the business district overnight. By morning, it had taken much of downtown Fall River with it. Stores, offices, entire blocks of the commercial center the mill's own money had built 2 generations earlier. The city rebuilt its downtown almost immediately, in the middle of losing the industry that had paid for the original version of it. Most of what stands in downtown Fall River today, the storefronts, the theater blocks, the office buildings along South Main, dates from 1928 and 1929. Raised in the same 2 years, the mills upstream were being sold off for scrap. The tax base that had funded that rebuilding could not survive what the mills had done to it. Assessed property values fell with every closure. Delinquent bills piled up faster than the city's shrinking revenue could absorb, and a government built for boom year spending had set aside little for the years the boom did not come back. In 1931, Fall River declared bankruptcy, one of the first major American cities to do so. Massachusetts answered by installing a state board of finance, an appointed body with authority over the city's budget that stayed in place for a decade. Fall River's own elected government kept meeting after that. It no longer decided how the city's money was spent. Down at the harbor, none of it had reached the boats yet. The Fall River line was still running every night on the schedule the Bordens had set in 1847, still carrying passengers to bed on the water, while the city above the wharf sat under state receivership. In 1937, that would end too. Chapter 8. The River Goes Under. The Fall River Line's last overnight boat left for New York in 1937. 90 years to the season after Richard and Jefferson Borden had first put a steamer on the route in 1847. There was no ceremony built into the schedule. The boat simply cast off at its usual evening hour, ran the Sound overnight the way it had run it for 90 years, and did not sail again the next night or the night after that. The math had been turning against it for a decade before 1937 ever arrived. Automobiles on paved highways and overnight buses running the same route in half the time, siphoning off exactly the ordinary travelers who had once filled the cheaper berths, leaving a fleet built for a different century competing for a shrinking population of passengers who still wanted to arrive at breakfast rather than midnight. The pier that had loaded sitting presidents and touring millionaires into staterooms for 9 decades, the same pier where cotton and finished cloth had ridden out beneath the passengers' feet, went quiet, with almost no notice. A business closing not because it had failed on its own terms, but because a city built to fill it no longer had the freight or the fares to keep it running. By 1940, the census recorded what the pier already knew. Fall River's population had begun falling, and it would keep falling year after year for the next 50. The line had outlasted the mills that financed it by more than a decade. It did not outlast them by much longer than that. Then, briefly, the war gave the granite buildings something to do again. Uniform cloth and parachute silk. The same kind of government contract that had disguised the print cloth collapse of the 1920s for a few wartime years. Filled order books that had sat empty through the worst of the Depression, and for a stretch in the early 1940s, the bells over South Main rang on something close to the old schedule. It did not last, and it was never going to. When the military contracts ended in 1945, what moved into the vacated floors was not spinning, it was sewing. Garment shops, small operations cutting and stitching finished clothing rather than spinning thread or weaving bolts, leased space in the same granite mills the Bordens and the Durfees had raised, at wages a fraction of what a mill hand had earned 40 years earlier. The garment trade would keep some of those floors occupied for decades, longer than the spinning operations that had trained the same workers' grandparents, but the wages set the tone for everything that followed. This was no longer a city that made cloth from raw cotton. It cut and stitched what arrived already woven, on contract, and contracts move. And then, in the 1960s, the state came for the river itself. Interstate 195 was routed directly through the center of Fall River, a raised concrete corridor cut across the same ground the Quequechan had been falling through since long before anyone incorporated a town beside it. Whole blocks of tenements and shop fronts near the water went with it, cleared for the right-of-way, the kind of demolition that federal highway money was paying for in city after city during those same years. The falls themselves, the ones that had turned Richard Borden's first grist wheel in 1821, the ones that had powered every mill from the ironworks to the American Printing Company for a century and a half, were blasted apart, boxed into culverts, and paved over to carry the highway grade. Not a metaphorical burial, an actual one. Dynamite, concrete pipe, and asphalt laid down over 8 waterfalls that a Wampanoag name had once described simply as falling water. The city that existed because of a waterfall paves the waterfall. 2 years after the last of the falls disappeared under the highway grade, something considerably larger arrived at the harbor to take their place as the thing worth driving into Fall River to see. It was not built for speed, and it would never again leave its pier under its own power. Chapter 9: The Water Still Falls. What arrived at the Fall River waterfront in 1965 was a battleship. Not a plaque, not a statue, not a bronze marker. The USS Massachusetts herself, a veteran of Casablanca and most of the Pacific campaigns that followed, towed up the Taunton River and moored a few hundred yards from the granite footprint of the old ironworks. She had not lost a single sailor to enemy fire in 3 years of war, and she would spend the rest of her existence not moving at all. Around her, the harbor filled in the way a museum fills in. The submarine USS Lionfish, the destroyer USS Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., a squadron of PT boats built for speeds she never had. Battleship Cove became, hull by hull, the largest collection of World War II naval vessels anywhere in the world. A city that had once measured itself in spindles, now measured itself in tonnage, that would never spin anything again. The people who kept the neighborhoods around that harbor occupied were, in large part, the same people who had been arriving by packet ship out of the Azores since the 1870s. And they did not stop when the spindles stopped. Portuguese immigration continued through the 20th century, long after the Lancashire spinners and the French-Canadian trainloads had trickled to nothing, until the city became, and remains, the most densely Portuguese-American city in the country. By some counts, close to half its population traces to the Azores or mainland Portugal. The 6 languages that once crossed a single mill floor are down to 2 now, spoken over bakery counters that still turn out broa and malassadas on Saturday mornings. Inside social clubs with the Portuguese flag in the window, at summer feasts that close whole blocks, for saints most of the country has never heard of. The mills abandoned the flats, the feasts did not. The house on 2nd Street is still there too, and it still does business. Andrew and Abby Borden's home operates today as a bed and breakfast and a museum, where guests pay to sleep in the room where Abby was found, and to be photographed on the staircase Bridget Sullivan climbed on August 4th, 1892. The crime that once embarrassed a mill aristocracy built on the ironworks, the banks, and the Fall River line now draws Halloween tours and true crime pilgrims from 3 states over. A hatchet did more for the city's name recognition than any spindle count the mills ever published. Fall River today holds around 94,000 people, fewer than the city counted in the 1900 census. With a median household income among the lowest in the state, the granite the Bordens and the Durfees quarried turned out to be the one part of the city too solid and too expensive to tear down. Most of the great mills still stand. Granite, Pocasset, American, Border City, not spinning cotton anymore, but selling it, or something like it. Outlet clothing racks where looms once ran. Self-storage units stacked to the ceilings that once carried shafting. The Durfee High School bell tower still stands watch above the flats, ringing hours now instead of shift changes. Walk the waterfront today, and the whole arc is visible in a single sweep of the eye. The battleship sits at her pier, gray and enormous and going nowhere. The newest fixed point on a shoreline that has not moved in 2 centuries. Behind her, the last of the granite mill towers stand against the sky, gapped where others came down for scrap or for the highway right-of-way. Between them runs Interstate 195 on its concrete embankment, carrying traffic across the ground where the Kekishan's ponds once stepped down toward the bay. Under that embankment, in the dark, the Kekwishan still runs through the culverts that buried it. It drops the same 130 feet across the same half-mile of granite it has dropped across since long before any mill wheel was set into the riverbed. 8 lanes of interstate traffic cross above it every day at 60 miles an hour, with nothing at the guardrail to suggest a river is down there at all, let alone the 8 Falls, a Wampanoag name, once described simply as falling water. The water is still headed for Mount Hope Bay, the way it always was. It just goes there in the dark now.